In 363 AD, a gathering of bishops convened in secret and reached a decision that would govern what billions of human beings believed about Jesus for the next 1700 years. They sifted through texts that the earliest Christians had been studying, duplicating, and teaching from across generations. And when their deliberations ended, certain books were declared forbidden. Copies were pursued. Manuscripts were destroyed by fire. And an entire dimension of who Jesus really was, not simply a loving shepherd, not simply a suffering servant, but something far more overwhelming, was quietly stripped from the awareness of the Western Christian world. But here's what those bishops failed to foresee. Thousands of miles southward, hewn into the mountainsides of the Ethiopian highlands, monks had already been replicating those exact texts under the flicker of oil lamps for centuries before that council ever sat down. And they never ceased. They never got word of the decision. They never bowed to the command. And what they guarded, what survived inside those rooms carved from rock, is now shaking loose the bedrock of everything the Western Church assumed it knew about Christ. And when Mel Gibson encountered it, he uttered 4 words that ought to stop every Christian cold. He said, "You need to go to hell." He wasn't being coarse. He was entirely serious, and what he was driving at, what he has spent upward of 20 years laboring to capture on screen, is a portrayal of Jesus so immense, so fearsome, so stunningly beautiful that it exposes the version most of us grew up with as a pencil sketch of the Son. This is the story of what was buried, who buried it, who kept it alive, and why the filmmaker behind the most commercially successful faith movie in history is staking everything, for a second time, that the world is finally ready to see it. Rewind to 2004. Mel Gibson puts out The Passion of the Christ. Hollywood turned its back. Studios declined to distribute it. He put his own financial future on the line to get it produced. He filmed it in Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew, languages no studio executive imagined audiences would endure. The film chronicled the final 12 hours of the life of Jesus, and it was brutal, uncompromising, and reverent. Critics forecast failure. It grossed over $600 million across the globe. It rose to become the highest-grossing R-rated film in American history, a distinction it carried for nearly 2 decades. But here's the piece that nearly everyone missed at the time. Gibson declared, publicly and more than once, that the Passion represented only the first half of the story. The crucifixion was not the end. And the resurrection, the actual resurrection, the one he believed no audience had ever truly beheld, was something he was not yet ready to present. Not because the will wasn't there, because he hadn't figured out how. Sit with that. The filmmaker who depicted the suffering of Christ with a raw physical honesty that left audiences sobbing in movie theaters said the resurrection was harder, not merely harder from a technical standpoint, harder from a spiritual one. Because the resurrection, the way Gibson comprehended it, was not a man emerging from a cave and saying hello to the people he knew. It was a cosmic event, a tear in the very fabric of existence. And to render that on film, he needed something greater than what the 4 Gospels by themselves could offer. That search stretched across more than 2 decades, and it guided him to texts that the overwhelming majority of Western Christians have never been exposed to. Texts housed within a single Christian tradition, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, that carries not 66 books in its Bible, not 73 as the Catholic Church does, but as many as 88. 22 more than the Catholic canon holds. 44 more than what sits in most Protestant Bibles. And among those extra books are writings so old, so remarkable, and so profoundly connected to the New Testament itself that when you first lay eyes on them, the question isn't whether they deserve a place. The question is why they were ever stripped out. The book that upends everything is known as First Enoch. And before you dismiss it as some obscure extra-biblical oddity, there are 3 facts you must reckon with. First, it's extraordinarily old. The earliest sections date back to roughly 300 BC, centuries before Christ drew his first breath. Second, it surfaced among the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd out searching for a wandering goat flung a rock into a cave beside the Dead Sea, heard the sound of pottery breaking, and stumbled into one of the most monumental archaeological discoveries in the history of humanity. Among those scrolls, kept intact for 2,000 years inside desert caves approximately 20 miles east of Jerusalem, were 11 manuscripts of 1st Enoch. 11. This was not some fringe document. This was a broadly copied, deeply honored book in the civilization that birthed Christianity. And the third fact, the one that ought to give every Bible-believing Christian genuine pause, is this. The New Testament itself cites it. Jude, verses 14 and 15. Go open your Bible and read the passage. Jude directly quotes from the words of Enoch. The New Testament invokes a book that doesn't appear within its own pages. Sit with that for a moment. The very scriptures we revere as the Word of God reference a text that was later shut out of the Western canon. The book was known to the first Christians. It was known to the apostles themselves. And then, it was marginalized. Why? The answer pulls us back to those bishops in 363 AD, the Council of Laodicea, and further still, to an empire that needed a religion it could steer. When Constantine installed Christianity as the faith of Rome, everything was altered, not only politically, theologically, because an empire demands unity, and unity demands a standardized message, and a standardized message demands a settled canon, and certain texts that stressed direct encounters with God, voyages through the heavens, cosmic hierarchies, combat among angels, and the breathtaking pre-existence of Christ refused to sit neatly inside a system anchored to institutional control. If a common believer could meet the living God directly through vision and revelation, what remained of the authority of bishops, councils, and Rome? So the wider portrait was cropped. The incandescent cosmic Christ was dimmed. And over the course of centuries, Renaissance artists put the finishing touches on the work. They rendered a Jesus who looked European, gentle, easy to approach, a figure you could display on a wall without feeling the earth tremble beneath your feet. And for the bulk of Western Christians, that rendering became the complete picture. But it was never the complete picture. Now hear what Enoch actually proclaims, because this is where it becomes staggering. In the portion known as the Parables, chapters 37 through 71, Enoch describes a figure he calls the Son of Man, the Chosen One, the Righteous Judge. This figure exists before creation itself. He is hidden in the presence of the Most High before the foundations of the world were established. He sits upon a throne of glory, and all the kings and the mighty ones of the earth will look upon him and be filled with dread. His face blazes with intolerable light. His eyes burn like fire. His voice sounds like rushing waters. His hair is white like wool. Now open the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verses 14 through 16. John of Patmos, putting pen to parchment around 95 AD, describes the risen Christ in these terms: hair white like wool, eyes like flames of fire, feet like bronze refined in a furnace, voice like the sound of many waters, a sharp sword extending from his mouth, and his face shining like the sun blazing at full power. The parallels are not vague. They are razor sharp. And here's the weight of it. Either John arrived at the identical imagery as Enoch independently, a text penned centuries ahead of him, or John was tapping into a tradition that had already rendered the Christ in cosmic, pre-existent, overpowering terms. A tradition that the Ethiopian church upheld and the Western church cast aside. Scholar George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa invested decades in the study of 1st Enoch, and concluded that this text was deeply embedded in the theological soil of early Christianity. The Son of Man terminology Jesus himself adopted, the very title he favored for himself above any other, rings directly out of Enoch, not out of a Greek philosophical framework, not out of Roman imperial thought, out of a Jewish apocalyptic tradition maintained most completely in Ethiopia. And Enoch is not the only text those monks rescued. There is another book, one that may bear an even more direct connection to what Mel Gibson is assembling. It is called The Ascension of Isaiah. It dates to the late 1st or early 2nd century, though segments of it are probably composite, compiled across the span of the 1st through 4th centuries. And what it portrays is unlike anything most Western Christians have ever heard inside a church building or a Sunday school room. In the Ascension of Isaiah, the prophet is transported on a journey through 7 heavens. At each level, the glory magnifies, the light intensifies, the worship swells. And then Isaiah beholds something that brings everything to a standstill. He watches the beloved, the Christ, begin his descent, not from one heaven straight down to earth, through every one of the 7 heavens, slowly, with purpose. And at each level, the beloved masks himself. He veils his glory so that the angelic beings stationed at each tier fail to recognize him. He becomes steadily less distinguishable as he descends, until at last he arrives on earth as a baby born from a woman. Wholly human, wholly concealed, the infinite packed into the finite, glory clothed in vulnerability. He lives, he suffers, he dies. He descends deeper still, into the realm of the dead. And then he rises, and as he climbs back through those very same 7 heavens, something has shifted, the mask is removed, the veil is torn away. Every angelic being at every tier now perceives who moved through their midst, and they fall prostrate in worship. The Christ ascends in unveiled, blazing, sovereign glory, and every domain of creation bows. Now recall the things Gibson said about his resurrection film. He said it would transport you into other realms. He said you'd go to hell. He said you'd see the angels fall. He described one of the 2 scripts. Because the sequel is being crafted as a 2-part film, he described one as traditional and the other as, using his precise words, like an acid trip. Reported budget, $100 million. Distribution handled by Lionsgate. Filming at Cinecit Studios in Rome. Part 1 opens Good Friday 2027. Part 2 follows 40 days later, on Ascension Day. When Gibson said these things during interviews on the Joe Rogan Experience in a 2022 feature with the National Catholic Register, he was not trading in vague artistic metaphors. He was describing a framework, a cosmology, a multi-layered descent and ascent of Christ through seen and unseen dimensions of reality. And the text that maps that framework with the most precision is the Ascension of Isaiah, a text that survived in Ethiopia, a text the Western Church walked away from. If you followed this message all the way to this point, I want you to pause and weigh what this means. Not merely historically, not merely theologically, personally. What version of Jesus have you been carrying around in your imagination? A kind teacher? A decent man who loved children and extended forgiveness to sinners? He was those things. But if Enoch and Isaiah are telling the truth, if the tradition Ethiopia safeguarded is genuine, then Jesus is also the pre-existent Son of Man, whose face blazes more brilliantly than the sun, who came down through layers of reality to reach you, who broke into death itself and walked back out, dragging its keys behind him, and who at this very moment sustains the structure of existence through the sheer force of his being. This is not an image on a church wall. This is the Creator planted inside his own creation. And the people who kept that portrait intact were not academics in well-appointed libraries. They were monks living at the edge of the known world. The Ethiopian highlands are among the most inaccessible terrain anywhere on Earth. Cliffside monasteries grip rock faces that fall away into nothing. Debre Damo, as one example, perches atop a cliff 15 meters tall with no staircase, no path, just a leather rope to pull yourself up. For over 1,500 years, monks dwelling in places like this have been copying manuscripts by hand. They readied parchment from the hides of goats. They mixed their ink from minerals and plants. They worked by the light of oil lamps in stone rooms that were cold at daybreak and blazing by midday. The toil hunched their backs, cramped their fingers, and deteriorated their vision. And they carried on anyway, year upon year, century upon century, because they held the conviction that they were copying the Word of God, not the trimmed version, but the whole of it. Ethiopia turned to Christianity in the 4th century under King Ezana of the Aksumite Empire, placing it among the oldest Christian civilizations the world has ever known. And when Islamic expansion surged across North Africa during the 7th century, Ethiopia became geographically marooned, severed from Rome, severed from Constantinople, severed from the councils and the ecclesiastical politics and the arguments about which books belonged. And that isolation, which the rest of the world regarded as a weakness, turned out to be the single greatest act of preservation in the history of Christianity. Because while the West was narrowing its scope, Ethiopia was holding firm. While copies of Enoch were being incinerated across Europe, Ethiopian scribes were setting them down on fresh parchment. While the ascension of Isaiah was slipping from Western awareness, Ethiopian priests were reading it aloud in their worship. The evidence of what they preserved is staggering. Within the monastery of Abba Garima, researchers found the Garima Gospels, illuminated manuscripts that a team from Oxford dated to as early as 330 to 660 AD. That positions them among the most ancient surviving illustrated gospel books anywhere on Earth. Older than the celebrated Rabula Gospels, dated to 586. Older than nearly anything comparable throughout Europe. And that is just a single monastery. Scholars estimate that Ethiopia harbors as many as 350,000 Christian manuscripts, spread across roughly 20,000 churches and 8,000 monasteries. Gundo Monastery alone houses over 220 volumes. This is not a footnote in the Chronicle of Christianity. This is one of the most expansive surviving repositories of ancient Christian thought on the planet, and it is in peril. In November 2020, armed conflict erupted in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, the ancestral heartland of Ethiopian Christianity. Monasteries came under bombardment. 326 clergy members were slain within the first 3 months alone. At least 40 churches and monasteries were documented as having sustained damage. And from one single monastery, reports emerged that 3,000 parchment manuscripts and 300 ancient crosses had been seized. Ancient texts, manuscripts monks had shielded for a millennium, began surfacing on eBay. A 2025 AI-driven initiative at the University of Groningen, bearing Enoch's name, has started dating some of these manuscripts and found that certain writings are 50 to 150 years older than earlier estimates had proposed. The urgency is undeniable. Time is slipping away. What monks salvaged from the fires of the 4th century is now imperiled by the warfare of the 21st. And here is the question that should haunt every believer who learns this. If the Book of Enoch is old enough to predate Christ by 3 full centuries, if it turned up in 11 copies among the Dead Sea Scrolls, if the New Testament directly cites it, if its portrayal of the Son of Man matches precisely with the risen Christ described in Revelation, then what does? It mean that we were never informed? What does it mean that most Christians walking the earth today have never read even one line of it? If the ascension of Isaiah sets forth a multi-dimensional descent and ascent of Christ through strata of heavenly reality, and if that vision is so powerful that Mel Gibson invested 20 years of his life in the attempt to film it, then what does it tell us about the version of the resurrection most of us were taught? A man comes out of a tomb. His friends are surprised. He eats some fish. He says goodbye. Was that actually all there was to it? Or was there a cosmic dimension so vast, so terrifying, so exquisite that it was easier to leave it out than to try to explain it? The Ethiopian church never left it out. They preserved a Christ who is not only the Good Shepherd, but the blazing judge of Enoch, the chosen one whose very presence makes the mountains melt and the mighty tremble. They preserved a Christ who descends through 7 heavens veiled in disguise, enters death itself, and returns unveiled in a glory that strikes every power in every dimension into silence. They preserved a Christ who doesn't simply forgive sins, but restores the original design of creation, whose miracles aren't merely acts of kindness, but the Creator directing His world back into alignment. When He gives sight to the blind, it's not charity, it's authority. When He commands the storm to cease, it's not a magic trick. It's the voice that spoke the waters into existence, reminding them who made them. When He raises the dead, it's not impressive. It's inevitable. Because death cannot hold the source of life. And every text Ethiopia preserved points toward this same overwhelming reality. The early church father Tertullian knew these texts. Irenaeus referenced this tradition. Origen grappled with it. And then, gradually, as the institutional church tightened its grip, the expansive portrait was replaced with something smaller, something less dangerous, something that could be housed within 4 walls and managed by a hierarchy. And the Christ of Enoch, the pre-existent, cosmos shaking, heaven descending, death invading Christ, was quietly filed away. Until now. If this story has taken hold of something deep within you, if you feel a door swinging open that you didn't see coming, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel, because what we're unearthing here is not a single video. It's a journey. And leave a comment, not simply for the sake of engagement, but because when you give voice to what's stirring in your spirit, it takes shape. Tell me, did you know about these texts? And does this alter the way you see Christ? Because here is where all the threads converge. Mel Gibson, the filmmaker who placed the suffering of Christ before the eyes of the world, is now preparing to place the risen Christ before those same eyes. And not the hushed, polished version. The version that ventures into hell and comes back. The version that passes through dimensions. The version that the ascension of Isaiah laid out and that Ethiopian monks defended with their bodies, their eyesight, and their lives. He's putting it out in 2 parts. Part 1 on Good Friday. Part 2 on Ascension Day. 40 days separating them, reflecting the biblical timeline itself. At the American film market, buyers were told they would not be permitted to read the scripts before committing. You either placed your faith in Gibson's vision, or you didn't. And what he has described, other realms, the fall of angels, the harrowing of hell, a nonlinear rupture in reality, maps so accurately onto the tradition Ethiopia preserved that the convergence cannot be written off as coincidence. Different centuries, different continents, same cosmic Christ. And that Christ is not a theory. He's not a talking point. He's not a painting hanging in a museum or a character in a film. He is, according to every text Ethiopia held on to and every text the councils sought to destroy, the living word through whom all things hold together. If that word were withdrawn for even a single moment, creation would cease to be. Not slowly, in an instant. The atoms composing your body are sustained by a power that Enoch stood before face to face and could barely find words for. That is the Christ the Ethiopian Bible reveals. Not a milder one, not a more manageable one. A Christ so immense that the version most of us were given is like staring at a candle flame and imagining you've seen the sun. The original was never lost. It was just waiting. in stone rooms on cliff faces, copied under lamplight, defended by monks who never once stopped believing that the full story mattered. And now, after 1,700 years, that story is descending from the mountains. The painting on the church wall will never look complete again. And the real question, the one that should follow you long after this video has ended, is not simply what was hidden about Christ. It's this. If they buried this much, what else still lies in wait inside those monasteries, inscribed in Ge'ez, on parchment made from goatskin, by hands that trembled not out of weakness, but under the weight of what they were committing to the page? What else did they bury?